In 1985, a young climber named Simon Yates pulled a knife out of his pack. He was perched on a crumbling snow slope 20,000 feet up in the Peruvian Andes, holding the weight of his best friend who was dangling over a 150-foot abyss. The rope was taut, the anchor was failing. Simon had a choice. They both die or he cuts the rope. So he cut the rope. His friend plummeted into the darkness, and Simon walked away assuming his friend was dead. But what happened next is the most miraculous survival story in the history of human endurance. This is the story of a man who crawled back from the grave. Welcome to the Mantle, and today we honor Joe Simpson. Joe Simpson was born in 1960 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. His father was a British Army officer, which meant Joe's childhood was spent in motion, moving in between military postings. When his family finally settled in the north of England, Joe discovered the Lake District. In those jagged fells and grey crags, he found his calling, climbing. By his early 20s, Joe wasn't just a weekend climber, he was a specialist in the difficult. He was drawn to the routes others avoided, remote, cold, and technically punishing. In 1985, he and his partner Simon Yates set their sights on Sula Grande in Peru, specifically the west face. No one had ever climbed it. For Joe and Simon, that wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. These guys wanted to test themselves. The climb up was a masterpiece. They moved alpine style, fast and light, carrying everything on their backs. They fixed ropes, cut steps into the ice, and navigated vertical walls of snow. They reached the summit, standing on top of the world, having conquered the west face. But in mountaineering, the summit is only the halfway point. The descent was a nightmare. The weather turned instantly. A storm rolled in, turning the mountain into a blinding whiteout. Visibility vanished. During a technical section of the descent, Joe stepped onto a snow fluting that looked solid, but it wasn't. And the snow collapsed, Joe fell, and the impact was catastrophic. His right leg hit the slope and the snow collapsed. Joe fell and the impact was catastrophic. His right leg hit the slope with the force of a car crash. The tibia didn't just break in his leg, it was driven upward, shattering the knee joint and splitting his femur. His leg folded in a way that should have been fatal. At 21,000 feet, a broken leg is a death sentence. But Simon Yates refused to let Joe die. Simon began an agonizing rescue mission. He tied their two 150-foot ropes together, creating a 300-foot lifeline. He would sit in the snow, anchor himself, and then lower Joe as far as the rope would go. Then Joe would signal, Simon would climb down, and they'd do it all again. But the storm was screaming. Simon couldn't see or hear Joe. Simon lowered Joe over the edge of a massive hidden ice cliff. Joe was now dangling in midair, 150 feet above the floor of a giant crevasse. And here is a technical detail that changed everything. The knot that Simon had tied that joined the two ropes together as he was lowering Joe down reached his braking device. And because Joe's full weight was on the line, Simon couldn't move the knot through. So they were stuck on the knot with Joe dangling and Simon holding his weight. Simon was being pulled out of his snow seat and the anchor was failing. Believing Joe was about to pull them both to their deaths, Simon took out his knife and cut the rope. Joe fell 150 feet into the blackness of a crevasse, but he didn't die. He landed on a fragile snow bridge deep inside the ice. He laid there in the dark for hours, surrounded by walls of blue ice. He could see a faint glimmer of light far above, but he knew he couldn't climb out. Instead, Joe did the unthinkable. He decided to lower himself deeper into the crevasse. He figured if there was a way in, there had to be a way out at the bottom. So, dragging his shattered leg, he rappelled into the abyss. He found a sloping snow ramp that angled toward the surface, and he crawled towards a tiny hole of light. And after hours of agonizing movements, he pulled himself out onto the glacier. He was out of that hole, but he was miles from the base camp. Simon was gone, and he had no food, no water, and one leg that was essentially a bag of broken glass. The next 4 days were a descent into madness. Joe couldn't walk, so he hopped. When he couldn't hop, he crawled. He dragged his body across boulder fields of jagged rock that tore the skin off his knees and his hands. To stay sane, Joe broke his world into 30-minute goals. Reach that rock in 30 minutes, or you're a dead man. He repeated the same monotonous songs in his head, specifically Boney M's Brown Girl in the Ring, just to keep a rhythm. He was severely dehydrated. He lost 40 pounds in 96 hours. By the final night, he was hallucinating, hearing voices, and smelling the camp's latrine. He reached the camp at midnight on the 4th night. He was shouting Simon's name, and Simon was so consumed by guilt, he was preparing to leave the next day at sunrise and thought he was hearing a ghost. He opened the tent and found Joe, which looked like a skeleton covered in frost, dragging a dead leg. Joe Simpson's story didn't end on the mountain. Doctors told him he'd never walk again, let alone climb, but 18 months later, he was back on the peaks. He wrote Touching the Void to defend Simon Yates, telling the world that Simon had done the right thing by cutting the rope. He turned the tragedy into a legacy of resilience, becoming one of the most powerful speakers in the world, and that book was also turned into a movie. Joe Simpson proved that even when you're at the bottom of the void and the rope has been cut, with enough perseverance, you can still find a way home. I hope you enjoyed that story. If you did, please subscribe. And if you have a story or know of a story we should cover, please leave it in the comments. We read every one. And as always, I will see you in the next episode.